The late morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 302, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Dr. Eleanor James sat quietly in the third row, her silver-streaked hair neatly styled and her posture perfectly straight, despite her 68 years. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress, with a strand of pearls that she occasionally touched, a habit she had developed during her 40 years of teaching constitutional law. The traffic court buzzed with nervous energy as defendants shuffled papers and whispered to their companions. The room itself spoke of authority, with its high ceilings, dark wood panels, and the imposing American flag standing beside the judge's bench. The air conditioning hummed softly, barely masking the tension that filled the space. Dr. James watched as a young court officer moved efficiently between the rows, organizing papers and directing latecomers to available seats. She had spent countless hours in courtrooms throughout her career, but always on the other side, as an expert witness, a consultant, or an observer for her research on judicial bias. Today, she found herself in an unfamiliar position as a defendant for an alleged traffic violation. Through the open doors, more people trickled in, filling the wooden benches until the room was nearly full. Dr. James observed them with the keen eye of someone who had spent decades studying human behavior in legal settings. There was a young mother trying to quiet her baby, an elderly man in work clothes who kept checking his watch, and several suited professionals who were probably hoping to handle their tickets quickly before returning to their offices. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out clear and authoritative. "All rise. The Court of the Third District is now in session, the Honorable Judge Richard Morton presiding." The shuffle of feet and rustle of clothing filled the air as everyone stood. Dr. James rose smoothly, her movements deliberate and dignified. Judge Morton entered the courtroom with quick, purposeful steps. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with graying hair at his temples and wire-rimmed glasses that he adjusted as he took his seat. His reputation preceded him, known for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for excuses. His stern expression surveyed the room as he settled into his large leather chair. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying easily through the courtroom. The sound of bodies settling back onto wooden benches echoed through the space. Dr. James noticed how the judge's eyes barely swept over the assembled citizens before him, as if they were merely items on a checklist to be processed. The morning proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Judge Morton moved through case after case with barely a pause between them. His responses seemed almost predetermined. Guilty with fine. Points on your license. Next case. There was little room for explanation or context in his courtroom. Dr. James watched each case carefully, her academic mind automatically analyzing patterns in the judge's behavior. She noticed how his tone varied slightly depending on the defendant's appearance, how he spent more time reviewing some cases than others. These were exactly the kind of subtle behavioral cues she had documented in her research on implicit bias in the justice system. As the minutes ticked by, she opened her small leather briefcase and reviewed her own documentation one more time. The traffic stop in question had occurred on a rainy evening 2 weeks ago. The officer had claimed she ran a yellow light, but Dr. James knew with certainty that the light had been green when she entered the intersection. She had gathered evidence, weather reports, timing sequences for that particular traffic light, and even photographs of the intersection's layout. Around her, other defendants showed varying signs of nervousness, shifting in their seats, repeatedly checking their phones, or whispering to their companions. But Dr. James remained still, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She had spent too many years in courtrooms to be intimidated by the setting. Her concern was not about the fine, which she could easily afford, but about the principle of justice itself. The young clerk managing the day's docket kept glancing in her direction. Something about her seemed to puzzle him, as if he was trying to remember where he might have seen her before. Dr. James gave him a gentle smile when their eyes met, causing him to quickly look back down at his papers. As the morning wore on, the number of people in the courtroom gradually dwindled. Each case took only a few minutes, with Judge Morton maintaining his rapid pace. The air in the room grew steadily more stale, and the sun had shifted to create new patterns on the wooden floor. Dr. James knew her case would be called soon. She was number 23 on the docket, and they were currently on number 21. She took a deep breath and straightened her papers one final time. In her decades of teaching and research, She had always emphasized to her students the importance of maintaining composure and dignity in the face of adversity. Today, she would have the opportunity to practice what she had preached. Case number 23, Eleanor James, the clerk announced, his voice echoing through the now half-empty courtroom. Dr. James rose gracefully from her seat, gathering her documents with steady hands. As she walked toward the defendant's podium, her low heels clicked softly against the wooden floor, each step measured and purposeful. Judge Morton barely looked up from his papers as she approached. He was already showing signs of impatience, having handled 22 cases in the past 2 hours. His fingers drummed quietly on his desk as he skimmed through the traffic citation in front of him. "Mrs. James," he began, emphasizing the Mrs. with a slightly condescending tone, "you're here for running a yellow light on 5th and Madison on the evening of April 15th. How do you plead?" "If I may, Your Honor," Dr. James replied, her voice clear and professional. "It's Dr. James, and I would like to present some evidence regarding the circumstances of that evening." The judge's head snapped up at her correction, his eyes narrowing slightly. He looked at her properly for the first time, an elderly black woman in a navy dress, standing with the kind of confidence he usually only saw in seasoned attorneys. His frown deepened. "Ma'am," he said, putting extra emphasis on the word, "this is a simple traffic violation. Either you ran the yellow light or you didn't. We don't need to complicate matters with unnecessary evidence." Dr. James remained unruffled by his dismissive tone. She had faced far worse during her early days as one of the few black female law professors in the country. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence is quite relevant. The traffic light in question has a documented timing issue that—" "Ma'am," Judge Morton interrupted, his voice sharp, "I've been handling traffic cases for 15 years. I don't need a lecture on traffic lights." Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone, but Dr. James remained steady. She tried again, her voice maintaining its professional calm. "Your Honor, if you would just look at the documentation I've brought." "Mrs. Dr. James," the judge cut in again, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose, "let me make this simple for you. The officer's report clearly states that you entered the intersection after the light had turned yellow. That's a violation, regardless of any timing issues you think might exist." The young clerk who had been watching the exchange suddenly straightened up, his eyes widening in recognition. He had been staring at Dr. James throughout the exchange, and something had finally clicked in his mind. He quickly began typing something on his computer. Furthermore, Judge Morton continued, his voice growing more irritated, "Your attempt to overcomplicate a straightforward traffic violation with unnecessary technical arguments is wasting this court's valuable time." Dr. James calmly opened her briefcase, removing a small stack of carefully organized papers. "Your Honor, as someone who has spent 40 years teaching constitutional law and publishing extensively on due process—" "Ma'am." The judge's voice rose sharply, causing several people in the gallery to jump. "I don't care if you've read every law book in the library. You ran a yellow light. The fine is $175 plus court costs." The clerk, who had been frantically searching something on his computer, suddenly stood up. His face had gone slightly pale. He quickly walked over to the judge's bench, a piece of paper in his trembling hand. Dr. James stood quietly, her dignity intact despite the judge's outburst. She had seen this pattern countless times during her research on judicial bias, the quick assumptions, the dismissive attitude, the refusal to consider evidence that might challenge those assumptions. It was like watching one of her own case studies come to life. Several of the remaining observers in the courtroom were now watching intently. Among them was a young attorney who had been waiting for his client's case. His expression showed growing recognition as he stared at Dr. James, and he quickly pulled out his phone, typing something urgently. The clerk reached Judge Morton's bench and leaned in close, whispering something while showing him the paper he'd brought. The judge's expression shifted slightly as he listened, his eyes darting between the paper and Dr. James. The color slowly drained from his face as the clerk continued whispering, pointing to something on the document. Dr. James remained at the podium, her posture straight, her expression serene. She had not raised her voice, shown anger, or lost her composure. She simply waited, knowing from decades of experience that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice was dignified silence. Judge Morton's face had turned an interesting shade of pink as he read the paper the clerk had handed him. His eyes moved rapidly across the page, and with each line, his previous air of authority seemed to deflate slightly. The clerk stood nervously beside the bench, occasionally glancing at Dr. James with a mix of awe and embarrassment. The young attorney who had been typing on his phone now raised his hand. "Your Honor, if I may," he said, standing up. "I was a student in Dr. James' constitutional law class at Harvard Law School 5 years ago. She's one of the nation's leading experts on judicial conduct and bias in the court system." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted noticeably. Other observers who had been half-dozing in their seats now sat up straight, their attention fully focused on the unfolding scene. The judge's dismissive attitude had suddenly become the center of an unexpectedly dramatic moment. "I see," Judge Morton said slowly, his voice having lost its previous sharp edge. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, buying time as he tried to regain his composure. "Dr. James, I apologize for my interruptions. Please proceed with your evidence." Dr. James opened her folder with the same calm deliberation she had shown throughout the proceedings. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone she had used in lecture halls for 4 decades. "As I was attempting to explain, the traffic light at 5th and Madison has been the subject of several complaints." She pulled out a series of documents, each one neatly labeled and organized. "These are official city maintenance records showing that the yellow light at this intersection is timed at 2.7 seconds, which is below the federal safety recommendation of 3.5 seconds for an intersection of this size and speed limit." The judge now listened intently, all traces of his previous impatience gone. More people had started entering the courtroom, word having somehow spread that something unusual was happening. Among them were 2 other lawyers who had clearly recognized Dr. James, their faces showing respect and interest. Furthermore, Dr. James continued, removing another document from her folder. "I have your weather reports from the evening in question, showing heavy rainfall that reduced visibility. Combined with the shortened yellow light timing, this created a situation where safe stopping would have been difficult for any driver." Judge Morton nodded slowly, actually looking at the evidence this time. The young clerk had returned to his desk but kept watching the proceedings with rapt attention. The courtroom remained unusually quiet, with even the usual shuffling and whispering having ceased. "I also have photographs showing that the traffic light is partially obscured by an overgrown tree branch," Dr. James added, presenting clear, professional quality pictures. "This obstruction, combined with the rain and shortened signal timing, creates what traffic safety experts call a multiple risk scenario." Several heads in the courtroom nodded in agreement. One of the recently arrived lawyers whispered to his colleague, "Classic James analysis, always thorough, always precise." Judge Morton studied the photographs carefully, his earlier dismissive attitude completely transformed. "Dr. James," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of uncertainty, "these are very compelling points you've raised about the intersection safety issues." "Yes, Your Honor," Dr. James replied. "And if I may add one final piece of evidence." She removed a last document from her folder. "This is a statistical analysis of accidents and near misses at this intersection over the past 6 months, showing a 40% increase in incidents during rainfall, particularly during yellow light transitions." The judge looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized how quickly he had dismissed such well-researched evidence earlier. The young attorney who had identified himself as her former student was now smiling slightly, as if watching a familiar scene unfold. "In light of this evidence," Dr. James concluded, her voice still perfectly modulated, "I would respectfully request that the court consider not just my individual case, but the broader public safety implications of this intersection's current configuration." The courtroom remained silent as Judge Morton processed all the information before him. His earlier certainty had been replaced by thoughtful consideration. Though traces of embarrassment still showed on his face, he was now experiencing firsthand what countless students and legal professionals had learned over the years, that underestimating Dr. Eleanor James was a significant mistake. The revelation of Dr. James's identity had spread beyond the courtroom. Through the open doors, more legal professionals from the courthouse had begun to gather, drawn by whispered words passed through the halls. Among them was District Attorney Sarah Chen, who had quoted Dr. James's work in numerous cases throughout her career. Judge Morton cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain his professional composure. "Dr. James," He began, his tone now entirely different from his earlier dismissive manner. Your evidence is quite thorough. However, I find myself curious about something else. Dr. James raised an eyebrow slightly but maintained her calm demeanor. Yes, Your Honor. You've presented this evidence with remarkable clarity, he continued, but I suspect you could have identified yourself immediately. You could have mentioned your credentials right at the start. Why didn't you? A small smile crossed Dr. James's face, the same smile that had preceded many powerful lessons in her classroom over the years. Your Honor, if I may speak frankly. The judge nodded, aware that every eye in the increasingly crowded courtroom was fixed on them. In my 40 years of studying judicial bias, Dr. James began, her voice clear and steady, I've observed that true learning rarely comes from being told about one's biases. It comes from experiencing them in action. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Had I announced my credentials at the start, would we be having this valuable discussion about due process and the importance of examining evidence thoroughly? Several of the lawyers in the gallery nodded in agreement. District Attorney Chen had pulled out a small notebook and was writing rapidly, clearly not wanting to miss any of Dr. James's words. Furthermore, Dr. James continued, every citizen in this courtroom deserves the same careful consideration of their evidence, regardless of their credentials. My title doesn't make my evidence more valid. The facts speak for themselves. Judge Morton's face flushed slightly as the implications of her words sank in. He glanced around his courtroom, really seeing it perhaps for the first time that day, the nervous defendants, the rushed proceedings, the quick judgments he'd been making. The young mother who was here earlier, Dr. James added gently, tried to explain about a school bus blocking her view of a stop sign. The construction worker attempted to show photos of incorrect street signage. Each of them had evidence they wanted to present. The judge's discomfort was now visible to everyone. He remembered dismissing those cases quickly, much as he had tried to dismiss Dr. James's case initially. The young clerk who had recognized her was now furiously taking notes, occasionally glancing up at Dr. James with undisguised admiration. Your Honor, Dr. James said, her voice taking on the patient tone she had used with thousands of students over the years, I've spent my career studying how justice is administered in our courts. In my experience, true justice requires time, attention, and the willingness to look past our initial assumptions. District Attorney Chen stepped forward from the gallery. Your Honor, if I may. At the judge's nod, she continued. Dr. James's article on implicit bias in traffic court proceedings is actually required reading for all prosecutors in our office. Her research has shown that rushed judgments in seemingly minor cases can have significant impacts on public trust in the justice system. The courtroom had grown so quiet that you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Judge Morton sat silent for a moment, looking at the evidence spread before him, then at Dr. James, and finally at the crowded gallery of legal professionals who had gathered to witness this unexpected lesson in judicial conduct. Dr. James, he finally said, his voice carrying a new note of humility, I believe you've given us all something important to think about today. He picked up the traffic citation and looked at it thoughtfully. More importantly, you presented clear and compelling evidence regarding both your specific case and a significant public safety issue. He reached for his gavel, but then paused, looking out at the gathered observers. The young mother from earlier had returned and was standing at the back of the courtroom. The construction worker had also reappeared, perhaps drawn back by the whispers circulating through the courthouse hallways. Judge Morton's hand rested on the gavel as he faced a decision that would go far beyond a simple traffic citation. In his 15 years on the bench, few moments have been as potentially transformative as this one. Judge Morton placed his gavel back on the bench without using it. The simple action seemed to carry great weight in the hushed courtroom. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that made him appear more human and less like the stern authority figure he'd been earlier that morning. Before I make my ruling, he said, his voice carrying a new tone of reflection, I'd like to recall cases number 14 and 19 from this morning. He looked toward the back of the courtroom where the young mother and construction worker stood. Would Ms. Peterson and Mr. Rodriguez please step forward? The young mother, clutching her baby closer, moved hesitantly toward the front. The construction worker followed, his hard hat still in his hands from his worksite. They stood beside Dr. James, forming an unexpected trio before the judge's bench. Miss Peterson, Judge Morton began. You tried to explain about a school bus blocking your view. Mr. Rodriguez, you had photos of incorrect street signage. He paused, looking at each of them. I owe you both an apology for not giving your evidence proper consideration. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. District Attorney Chen smiled slightly, jotting something else in her notebook. The young clerk watched with wide eyes, witnessing a moment that would likely be discussed in law schools for years to come. Dr. James, the judge continued, turning his attention back to her, your presence in my courtroom today has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how justice is administered here. He picked up her traffic citation and held it thoughtfully. But more importantly, you've shown us all that justice isn't about efficiency, it's about fairness and thorough consideration. Dr. James nodded slightly, her dignified presence a stark contrast to her earlier treatment. The pearls at her neck caught the afternoon light as she stood straight and attentive, every inch the distinguished professor she was. Therefore, Judge Morton announced, I'm making several rulings today. He shuffled through the papers before him. First, regarding Dr. James's case, not only am I dismissing the citation, but I'm also ordering an immediate safety review of the intersection at 5th and Madison. He turned to the young mother. Miss Peterson, please present your evidence about the school bus incident. Then to the construction worker, Mr. Rodriguez, I'd like to see those photos of the street signage. Both of them quickly stepped forward, their faces showing surprise and relief. The gallery had grown even more crowded. Word had spread through the courthouse, and now several judges from other courtrooms had quietly slipped in to observe. Among them was the chief judge of the district, watching the proceedings with keen interest. Furthermore, Judge Morton continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, I'm implementing new procedures in this courtroom effective immediately. He looked directly at his clerk. Every defendant will be given adequate time to present their evidence. No exceptions. Dr. James' expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed approval. She had witnessed countless moments of institutional change throughout her career, but few as immediate and direct as this one. I'm also requesting, the judge added, that Dr. James consider conducting a training session for our judicial staff on bias awareness and evidence evaluation. He looked at her hopefully, that is, if you're willing. Before Dr. James could respond, District Attorney Chen stepped forward again. Your Honor, the DA's office would be very interested in participating in such training as well. Several heads nodded in agreement around the courtroom. The chief judge moved forward from the back of the room. I believe, she said clearly, this could be valuable for all courts in our district. The significance of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. What had started as a simple traffic case had evolved into something much more meaningful. Dr. James finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years of teaching and advocacy. Your Honor, I would be honored to assist in any way I can. She paused, looking around the courtroom. After all, the goal of our justice system isn't just to administer law, but to ensure that every citizen receives fair and thorough consideration. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. The space that had begun the day as a simple traffic court had transformed into something else entirely, a place of learning, growth, and change. Judge Morton knew that tomorrow's sessions would be different, and so would all the days that followed. Word of what had happened in courtroom 302 spread through the legal community like wildfire. By late afternoon, local news reporters had gathered in the courthouse lobby, eager to cover the story of how a routine traffic court session had turned into a landmark moment for judicial reform. Dr. James sat in the courthouse cafeteria, sipping tea from a paper cup as she reviewed her notes for the upcoming training sessions. Around her, a small group had formed, Judge Morton, District Attorney Chen, and several other legal professionals who couldn't resist the opportunity to speak with her. Dr. James, a young public defender asked, clutching her own cup of coffee, I've read your paper on microaggressions in the courtroom at least 3 times. Would you consider including that in the training curriculum? Before she could answer, another voice joined the conversation. Eleanor, called out an elderly man walking toward their table. It was Judge William Thompson, now semi-retired, who had been one of the few supporters of Dr. James's early research back in the 1980s. William, Dr. James smiled warmly, standing to greet her old friend. I wondered if you might hear about today's events. Judge Thompson laughed softly. Hear about it? The whole circuit is talking about it. Though I can't say I'm surprised, you always did have a way of turning everyday moments into powerful lessons. Judge Morton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Dr. James noticed and gently steered the conversation in a different direction. William, we're actually discussing the training program I'll be conducting for the district. Your experience would be invaluable. Would you consider contributing? The cafeteria had grown busier as more people found excuses to come downstairs, hoping to be part of this impromptu gathering. The space normally cleared out by mid-afternoon, but today it was filling up with judges, lawyers, and court staff, all drawn by the presence of Dr. James and the energy of positive change. You know, Judge Thompson said, pulling up a chair, this reminds me of Eleanor's first major study on judicial bias. It was 1985, and nobody wanted to admit there might be systemic issues in our courts. He looked around the table, but she persisted, gathering data case by case, court by court. District Attorney Chen leaned forward eagerly. That study became the foundation for the national guidelines on judicial conduct, didn't it? Dr. James nodded modestly. The real change happened when judges and lawyers began to see these weren't just academic issues. They affected real people in real courtrooms every day. Judge Morton, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. Like what happened today, he said softly. Dr. James, I have to ask, did you choose my courtroom on purpose? A subtle smile crossed Dr. James's face. Let's just say I did my research, she replied diplomatically. Your court handles the highest volume of cases in the district, which means your procedures affect the most people. The young clerk who had first recognized Dr. James approached their table, carrying a stack of files. Dr. James, he said nervously, I've pulled the data you requested about case processing times and demographic patterns. Excellent, she responded, gesturing for him to join them. Everyone, meet David. He's going to help us analyze the current patterns so we can measure the effectiveness of our new procedures. Judge Morton looked at the files with interest. I'd like to review those as well, if you don't mind. I'm beginning to realize there's a lot about my own courtroom I need to understand better. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafeteria windows, casting a warm glow over the gathering. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into a collaboration, with people from all levels of the justice system coming together to learn and improve. You know, Judge Thompson said thoughtfully, in all my years on the bench, I've learned that the most important moments of change often come from unexpected places. He looked at Dr. James with admiration. Though I must say, Eleanor, turning a traffic ticket into a catalyst for district-wide reform might be a new record, even for you. Dr. James smiled as she watched Judge Morton begin to review the files with genuine interest. The young public defender was taking notes, while District Attorney Chen was already sketching out plans for implementing similar changes in other departments. This, she knew, was how real change happened, not through confrontation alone, but through the moment when understanding led to willing transformation. 1 month had passed since the memorable day in courtroom 302. The morning sun once again filtered through the courthouse windows, but this time it illuminated a very different scene. Judge Morton's courtroom was undergoing its first official review since implementing the new procedures. Dr. James sat in the back row, clipboard in hand, watching as Judge Morton handled each case with careful attention. The average time per case had increased from 3 minutes to 12, but something else had increased as well, the public's trust in the process. Your Honor, a teenager with bright blue hair was saying, I have video from my dashboard camera showing that the light was still green when I entered the intersection. Instead of dismissing the evidence, Judge Morton leaned forward with interest. Please share your footage with the court, he said, his tone patient and engaged. The young clerk, David, who had now become an integral part of the court's reform process, stepped forward to help set up the video display. Dr. James made another note on her clipboard. Beside her sat Professor Marcus Chen from the State University Law School, who had come to observe what was quickly becoming known as the James method of court administration. Remarkable, Professor Chen whispered. I'd never seen traffic court proceedings conducted with such thoroughness. He glanced at his watch. Though I notice you've helped them find ways to maintain efficiency despite the increased attention to detail. Dr. James nodded, watching as Judge Morton carefully considered the dashboard camera footage. The new system they had developed included pre-court evidence review and better scheduling to balance the need for thorough consideration with practical time constraints. The young mother from that first day, Miss Peterson, was now employed by the court as a community liaison, helping other defendants prepare their evidence properly before their court dates. She sat at a small desk near the entrance, quietly assisting a nervous elderly man with his paperwork. "Case dismissed," Judge Morton announced after reviewing the teenager's video evidence. "Additionally, I'm requesting a review of that traffic light's timing sequence." He made a note in his file. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." During a brief recess, Judge Morton approached Dr. James and Professor Chen. The change in him was striking. Gone was the impatient, dismissive demeanor, replaced by a thoughtful judicial presence. "Dr. James," he said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." He held up a manila folder. "Remember Mr. Rodriguez, the construction worker with the photos of incorrect street signage? His evidence led to the discovery of 12 other improperly marked intersections in low-income neighborhoods. We're having all of them corrected." Dr. James smiled, adding another note to her clipboard. "And how has the public responded to these changes?" The local community paper ran a story last week. David the clerk chimed in, approaching with a fresh stack of files. "Complaints about unfair treatment in traffic court have dropped by 60%. Professor Chen raised his eyebrows, impressed. "Any pushback from other judges about the increased time per case?" "Actually," Judge Morton replied, "3 other judges in the district have already adopted our new procedures. The chief judge is considering making them standard protocol across all traffic courts." The afternoon session brought another surprising development. A law student from the local university was presenting research on traffic fine impacts on different communities. Research that would have been dismissed without a second thought just a month ago. "Your Honor," the student said, "our data shows that standardized fines disproportionately affect lower-income residents. We'd like to propose a sliding scale based on ability to pay." Judge Morton listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions. Dr. James watched with satisfaction as the judge engaged with complex policy issues that he would have once considered beyond the scope of his traffic court. During the final recess of the day, District Attorney Chen stopped by with news. "The State Judicial Conference wants to feature our reform program at next month's meeting," she announced. "They're calling it a model for traffic court reform nationwide." Dr. James made her final notes of the day, reflecting on how a simple traffic ticket had sparked such significant change. The courtroom that had once been a place of rushed judgments and dismissed evidence had transformed into a laboratory for judicial reform. As the afternoon sun began to fade, she watched Judge Morton carefully reviewing one last case. The changes in his courtroom were more than just procedural. They represented a fundamental shift in how justice was administered at the most basic level. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in courtroom 302. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the windows of the state's largest conference hall, where hundreds of legal professionals had gathered for the annual judicial conference. The main topic this year, reforming traffic courts, the James Method. Dr. Eleanor James stood at the podium, her silver hair gleaming under the spotlights, her pearl necklace catching the light as she addressed the packed audience. In the front row sat Judge Morton, along with David the clerk, Ms. Peterson the community liaison, and other key members of what had become known as the 302 Reform Team. "Change," Dr. James began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "often comes from the most unexpected places. 6 months ago, I walked into a traffic court with evidence about a yellow light." A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. "Today, I stand before you to discuss how that moment has transformed traffic courts across our state." The giant screen behind her displayed impressive statistics, dramatic reductions in complaint rates, increased public trust scores, and most importantly, a significant drop in repeat offenses. The data told a story of success that went far beyond simple traffic violations. But numbers only tell part of the story, Dr. James continued, gesturing to Judge Morton. "The real change happens in the hearts and minds of those who serve in our courts. Judge Morton, would you join me?" Judge Morton walked to the podium, looking very different from the impatient man who had tried to dismiss Dr. James 6 months ago. He stood straighter, smiled more easily, and carried himself with a different kind of authority, one based on respect rather than power. 6 months ago, he began. "I thought efficiency was the measure of a good judge. Dr. James taught me that true justice cannot be rushed." He paused, looking out at his colleagues. "Yes, our cases take longer now, but every extra minute we spend ensures that justice is not just done, but seen to be done." From the audience, the young mother who had become their community liaison stood up. "The difference isn't just in the courtroom," she added. "People in the community talk about it. They don't fear traffic court anymore. They know they'll be heard." The presentation continued with examples from other courts that had adopted the James method. David, no longer just a clerk, but now the program's data analyst, shared statistics showing how the new approach had uncovered and corrected numerous systemic issues in traffic enforcement. "We found patterns we never knew existed," David explained, pointing to his charts. "Incorrect signage in low-income areas, malfunctioning traffic lights in minority neighborhoods, unclear parking restrictions in non-English-speaking communities. By taking the time to listen, we uncovered problems that affected thousands of citizens." As the presentation drew to a close, Dr. James returned to the podium for her final remarks. The room fell silent, everyone eager to hear her concluding thoughts. "When I walked into courtroom 302 that day," she said softly, "I carried with me 40 years of research on judicial bias. But more importantly, I carried hope. Hope that when people see their own biases clearly, they can choose to change." She looked at Judge Morton with a warm smile. "Some might have expected me to write an angry article about my treatment that day. Instead, we wrote a new chapter in judicial reform together." She turned back to the audience. "That's the real lesson here. Change doesn't come from pointing fingers. It comes from joining hands." The applause was thunderous. As people rose to their feet, many were already taking notes, eager to implement these changes in their own courtrooms. The Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court made her way to the podium. "Dr. James," she announced, "your work has shown us that even the smallest courtroom can be a place of profound change. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the James method will become standard procedure in all traffic courts across our state." More applause erupted. Dr. James stood quietly, her dignity and grace unchanged from that first day in traffic court. She watched as judges, lawyers, and court staff members clustered in excited groups, discussing implementation plans. The afternoon sun was setting now, casting a golden glow across the conference hall. In 6 short months, a simple traffic ticket had grown into a movement for judicial reform. But more importantly, it had shown that change was possible, one courtroom at a time, one judge at a time, one case at a time. As Dr. James gathered her papers, she smiled at the thought of all the future defendants who would never know her name, but who would receive fair hearings because of what had happened that day in courtroom 302.